imagine looking at a country's statistical profile, right?
Yeah.
And you see something that, well, according to standard developmental economics, should be basically impossible.
Right. A total paradox.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, on one hand, you've got this society with um, more doctors per capita than the United States.
Yeah, and an education system that honestly rivals wealthy European nations.
Right. And infant mortality rates that are so low, they actually beat out a lot of the industrialized world. So if you just stopped reading there, you'd think, okay, I'm looking at a highly advanced, super wealthy nation.
You'd assume it's a first world powerhouse, absolutely.
But then, you turn the page to the macroeconomic data, and suddenly you're looking at a manufacturing sector that's just, well, it's practically vanished.
They're just gone.
Yeah. And an agricultural system having these sudden, like, 20% collapses, plus an economy so starved for foreign exchange that it struggles to import even basic necessities.
Which is, I mean, the ultimate statistical paradox. Normally, global development has this pretty predictable sequence, right?
Right, like a standard timeline.
Exactly. A country industrializes, it accumulates capital and wealth, and then it uses that wealth to build those robust healthcare and education systems. The wealth comes before the health.
Always. But the data set we're analyzing today, it just completely shatters that chronological blueprint.
It really does. It flips the whole model upside down.
And that is exactly what we are exploring today. Welcome to the deep dive. If you're listening to this and wondering how a country can have, first world human capital, but operate on a third world economic framework, you are in the exact right place.
We are going through a massive empirical macro data study today.
Yes, we are. We're looking at the socioeconomic and demographic evolution of Cuba, spanning all the way from the 1960s through the 2020s. We've got decades of data here from places like the UN and the World Bank.
Which is incredible because it gives us this longitudinal MRI of the nation. We aren't just looking at a single year snapshot.
Right, it's the whole movie, not just a picture.
Exactly. We're tracking the long-term, multi-generational trajectories of their population, their healthcare density, education, and institutional governance.
Now, before we really get into it, I do want to set a clear boundary for you, the listener. If there's one thing most people know about Cuba, it's that its history and geopolitics are, well, they're intensely debated.
Highly charged, to say the least.
Yeah, super politically charged. It evokes incredibly strong opinions. But our mission today is strictly analytical. We are not here to debate ideology at all.
Right. We're not taking sides.
Nope, we aren't endorsing any political frameworks, and we definitely aren't here to moralize. Our goal is just to look at the empirical data provided by these international organizations. Trace the lines on the graphs and impartially report on the objective reality of how this nation developed.
And honestly, that impartiality is essential. Because the data itself is so fascinating, it doesn't even need political embellishment.
Okay, let's unpack this. When you look at the executive summary of this research, it's basically a dashboard with 4 major indicators, just like flashing red simultaneously.
Yeah, you've got rapid population aging, extreme volatility in national income, world-class medical density, and severe governance bottlenecks, all happening at once.
I was trying to think of a way to visualize this for anyone listening, trying to wrap their head around these contradictions.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like looking at the specs of a really bizarre, customized car.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. It's like they somehow managed to build a literal Formula One engine, which represents this incredibly healthy, universally literate population.
World-class human capital.
Exactly. But they took that world-class F1 engine and dropped it into a chassis with a shattered transmission and a rusted-out steering column, which is their macroeconomy and regulatory environment.
So you can rev that engine all you want, but the power it can't transfer to the wheels.
It goes nowhere.
What's fascinating here is that the structural constraints totally prevent the kinetic energy of the people from moving the nation forward. And to really understand how this asymmetry happened, we have to start with the demographics.
Right. The foundation of any economy is its people. Before you talk GDP or exports, you have to know who's actually working and buying things. Let's look at the UN World Population Prospects data.
So if we trace the curve from the early 1960s, it's actually a pretty standard growth trajectory for a mid-sized nation.
Starts at what, around 7 million?
Yeah, about 7.23 million people. And over the next few decades, it climbs steadily. They're expanding their labor force, growing domestic demand until it hits this historic peak.
Which was roughly 11.3 million.
Right. But that 11.3 million peak is where the growth story just hits a brick wall. The the recent data shows a historic reversal.
Yeah, it's not just growing slower now, it's actively shrinking.
Entering negative growth, it's falling back down to about 10.97 million. And, populations shrink for a few reasons: low birth rates, high mortality, or massive outward migration. But whatever the mix is, absolute shrinkage is just a massive red flag for an economy.
It's an economic earthquake, honestly.
Hmm.
When your population actively shrinks, the basic math of domestic demand changes. You have fewer people buying groceries, paying rent.
Fewer people paying taxes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And critically, fewer people entering the workforce to produce goods.
Hmm.
But that raw number, the 10.97 million, that's only half the story. The internal composition of those people is where the true crisis is.
The aging metrics. I remember looking at the chart for the 65 and older cohort and thinking, like, the slope of this line has to be a typo.
It's incredibly steep.
Because historically, people 65 and older made up just 4.2% of the total population, which is a super young, vibrant demographic.
Mhm.
But recently, that number skyrocketed to over 16.5%.
To give you some context on that, demographers usually classify a society as aging when that over 65 group crosses 7%.
And when it hits 14%, the society is officially considered aged. Cuba hasn't just crossed those thresholds, it blew right past them, and at a speed that's practically unheard of for a country in its income bracket.
Which brings us to a metric that I think is just crucial to understand, even if it sounds a bit nerdy, the old age dependency ratio.
Oh, yeah, this is the big one.
Let me break this down for you really quick. It's basically comparing two groups. On one side, you have retirees, right? People who generally need state pensions, social support, lots of medical care.
Right, the dependents.
Exactly. And on the other side, you have the working age population,
Right.
the people actually clocking in, creating economic value, and paying the taxes to fund those pensions and hospitals.
It's basically the mathematical scale of societal burden, and the data here shows this ratio spiking from historically about 7.1% to over 10.6% today.
And the curve is only getting steeper.
Yeah, the burden on every single active worker is growing heavier every single year.
Wait, let me stop you there because I want to make sure I'm interpreting this right for the listener. Normally, countries get what's called a demographic dividend.
Right, that sweet spot.
Yeah, they have a period where birth rates drop,
Hmm.
but they still have this massive, bulging generation of young workers. And wealthy countries like Japan or Germany use that window to hyper-industrialize and build wealth.
They got rich, and then they got old.
Right. So they have sovereign wealth funds and automated factories to pay for their retirees today. But looking at this, it seems like Cuba is facing the deep aging crisis of a wealthy European nation, but without the accumulated wealth to pay for it. Did they just completely miss the demographic dividend?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the crucial insight. They went through the demographic transition, life expectancy went up, birth rates plummeted, but their macroeconomy completely failed to capitalize on that temporary labor surplus.
Wow, so no massive industrial capital accumulation?
None. So they've arrived at the demographic profile of an advanced, wealthy economy, but without the financial reserves or the high-tech industrial base to support it.
That feels like a ticking time bomb. I mean, fewer workers, more retirees. The strain on the safety net must be immense. Mathematically, it puts a hard ceiling on what they can achieve economically unless productivity just skyrockets.
Precisely. Fewer workers means each worker has to generate way more value just to keep the lights on, let alone grow the economy.
Right.
But getting that kind of productivity leap requires a hyper-efficient, industrialized economy. And as we look at the macroeconomic data, that structural framework just isn't there.
Let's dig into that macro data, starting with gross national income, or GNI.
Yeah.
Because these numbers can be super deceptive.
Oh, highly deceptive.
If you just look at their GNI per capita in current U.S. dollars, it honestly looks like a success story. The line starts way down at like $40 per capita historically and climbs this nice, steady slope up past $9,000.
Yeah, you look at it and think, great, they're steadily getting richer.
Exactly. But standard developmental economics warns us that current dollar metrics can be a total mirage, right?
Yeah.
Especially with complex currency controls or massive inflation.
Right. The raw number goes up, but if purchasing power collapses, that wealth is just an illusion. To see the truth, we have to look at the constant 2015 dollar metric.
And for anyone listening, a constant dollar metric adjusts the data to strip out inflation and exchange rate weirdness. It pegs the value to 2015 so we see the actual apples-to-apples volume of goods and services being produced over decades.
And when you strip away that illusion and look at the constant 2015 data, that reassuring upward slope just vanishes. Instead, you see extreme volatility.
It seriously looks like a seismograph during an earthquake.
It really does. I mean, the real GNI per capita did see some genuine growth during certain periods, rising from around the $2,600 range up to about $5,441.
Which is decent.
It is. But the recent data reveals these brutal, sudden crashes, moments where the real GNI just cliff dives, wiping out years of gains and plummeting back down into the $3,000.
A drop from $5,400 to the $3,000 isn't a recession. That is a catastrophic contraction of national wealth. How does a country lose that much real value so fast?
The mechanism is a profound lack of structural diversification. It creates extreme vulnerability to external shocks.
So putting all their eggs in one basket.
Exactly. When an economy relies heavily on a single export or one international benefactor or just tourism, it has no internal shock absorbers.
Dang.
If global commodity prices shift or a trading partner has a crisis, the whole national income violently contracts.
And the data on their industrial sector explains exactly why that foundation is so narrow. If we want to know how an economy produces tangible value, we look at manufacturing. And here it's a story of profound deindustrialization.
The key metric is manufacturing value added as a percentage of GDP. In the earlier decades of our data, this sat around 17.6%.
Which is pretty solid. It's not an industrial juggernaut, but 17.6% means they have factories. They're making cement, textiles, basic consumer goods.
They're making things, yes. But over the timeline of our study, that 17.6% suffers this long-term structural collapse. It shrinks down to around 10% and sometimes even lower. The industrial base basically withered away.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because this means the economy is now overwhelmingly dominated by the services sector.
Right.
And I want to clarify this, because in the West we hear service economy and we think advancement. We think finance, software, consulting. But there is a huge difference between a service economy built on top of an automated industrial base and one that exists because the industrial base collapsed.
That is such a critical distinction. A service sector can generate revenue, sure, but you cannot eat services. You can't build housing out of services.
You can't run a hospital on services alone. You need actual syringes, beds, medication.
Exactly. When a country deindustrializes like this without replacing it with high-tech exports, it loses the physical capacity to produce tangible goods for its own citizens.
Which makes them hyper-dependent on external supply chains. If you don't make your own concrete or shoes, you have to buy them. And to buy them globally, you need hard currency. Yeah. But wait, before we look at the trade deficit, we have to talk about agriculture.
Oh, the agricultural bottleneck. It might be the most glaring systemic failure in the whole profile.
Because it genuinely baffled me. Let's look at the physical reality. The UN data shows Cuba have ample, highly stable agricultural land. Over 60,000 square kilometers of arable dirt.
The land is there. It's not going anywhere.
Right. Yet the agricultural value added swings wildly. It bounces between $2.1 billion and $5.1 billion, and recent data shows catastrophic negative growth. I'm talking crashes exceeding negative 20% in a single year.
It's incredibly erratic.
But wait, if they have 60,000 square kilometers of land and all these educated people, how do you get a 20% drop in food production? Is this just bad hurricanes?
Climate events definitely play a role, sure. Hurricanes and droughts happen. But weather doesn't fully explain sustained systemic volatility of this magnitude.
So it's not just the weather.
No. When you cross-reference this with the deindustrialization data, the real mechanism becomes clear. Modern agriculture isn't just a guy with a shovel. It's a deeply complex, resource-intensive industry.
Right. You need tractors, fuel, fertilizer.
Exactly. You need steady inputs of chemical fertilizers, advanced irrigation, fuel, and logistics to move the harvest. Because their domestic industrial base collapsed, they can't make these inputs themselves. They have to import them.
And if the state is starved for foreign exchange, they can't afford to buy fertilizer on the global market.
Right. The land is capable of producing food, but without imported fertilizer and fuel, yields plummet. Plus, there are rigid institutional frameworks dictating what farmers can grow and what price they can sell it for.
So you have supply chain starvation mixed with heavy bureaucracy. A 20% collapse almost seems mathematically inevitable at that point.
It really does.
So no manufacturing means importing goods. Failing agriculture means importing food. That puts an existential weight on their international trade balance. To buy from the world, you have to sell to the world.
But the data shows exports of goods and services have essentially stagnated. They've flatlined long-term between $4 billion and $5 billion.
While imports violently fluctuate between $6 billion and $12 billion.
Which tells us their domestic demand is entirely held hostage by their foreign exchange income.
Let me put this in everyday terms. Imagine your household makes $40,000 a year, right? But just to buy the bare minimum groceries and medicine to survive, you have to spend $80,000.
You're instantly underwater.
Yeah. You max out the credit cards for a bit, but eventually the credit runs out. When a nation hits that point, exports at $4 billion, baseline survival imports at $10 billion, what actually happens?
Chronic, severe shortages. The state literally has to stop buying things. And citizens feel that immediately at the supermarket, the pharmacy, the gas pump. The trade data perfectly reflects an economy structurally trapped in a low liquidity environment.
Okay, if we pause here and look at this picture, it's incredibly bleak. We've got a demographic time bomb, shrinking and aging, G&I volatility, profound deindustrialization, collapsing agriculture, a massive trade deficit.
It's a perfect storm of structural constraints.
Right, and based on any standard model, an economy like this should be generating catastrophic social outcomes. You'd expect failing schools, rampant illiteracy, abysmal life expectancy.
From a correlative standpoint, yes. If you feed these macro inputs into a predictive model, the output for human development would be deeply pessimistic.
But the data shows the exact opposite. And this is where the F1 engine from our analogy comes roaring to life. That data completely shifts from structural constraint to an undeniable human capital triumph.
This is the great paradox of the source material.
Let's pivot to healthcare. Because despite the macroeconomic roller coaster, their institutional focus on social services yielded extraordinary results.
Let's start with healthcare density, specifically doctors.
The numbers here are mind-bending. The data tracks medical professionals from the 1960s to today. Historically, they started with fewer than one doctor per 1,000 people. I think the number was 0.2.
Which is a severe medical shortage.
But over the decades, it didn't just inch up. It exploded to an astronomical 9.54 doctors per 1,000 people.
The sheer scale of that achievement really can't be overstated. They didn't just improve the system, they built a medical army.
I really want you to grasp how out of the ordinary this is. At 9.54 doctors per 1,000, they aren't just leading Latin America, they are vastly surpassing almost every high-income developed nation on Earth.
Absolutely.
I mean, wealthy Western nations usually hover around 2.5 to 4 doctors per 1,000. Hitting 9.54 is a massive statistical outlier. How does a country with a collapsing farm sector and no foreign exchange train that many doctors?
It's total state mobilization. When the state controls the educational and economic apparatus, it can channel human potential by fiat. They made medical training a core pillar of state ideology and survival.
Not just for themselves, right? Medical diplomacy, too.
Exactly. Exporting doctors as a service. They funneled their brightest students into medicine and built training infrastructure in every province.
And the empirical data proves this 9.54 number isn't just a vanity metric. It's not just a big number for international conferences. It translates directly into world-class health outcomes.
The public health metrics are remarkable. The male under 5 mortality rate plummeted from 52 down to under 11 per 1,000 live births.
Wow.
And overall infant mortality dropped from nearly 40 down into the single digits.
Single digits. Those are first-world health outcomes on a developing world budget. But wait, if they don't have the cash to import high-tech MRI machines or the newest drugs, how are they keeping infant mortality so low?
By heavily investing in a preventative, community-based public health model. If you can't afford to build a massive, high-tech ICU to save a severely ill infant, your only option is to ensure that infant never gets severely ill in the first place.
Ah, so you just put a doctor on every single block.
Precisely. They embedded doctors within the neighborhoods. It means aggressive prenatal care, universal vaccination, maternal nutrition support. They substituted capital, which they lacked, with labor, which they had an abundance of.
That is an incredible efficiency in translating limited resources into raw human longevity. And they didn't just keep people alive, they educated them to an incredibly high standard.
The education and gender parity data is just as extreme and just as successful.
Yeah, adult and youth literacy rates are practically universal, maintained at over 99.5%. You essentially cannot find an illiterate person in the demographic data.
But it goes beyond basic literacy. Let's look at the Gender Parity Index, or GPI. for school enrollment.
Right, which measures relative access to education for males versus females.
It's a crucial metric for social modernization. And when we look at female enrollment in secondary and tertiary education, high school and university, it doesn't just show equality. It actually tilts in favor of females. Women are outperforming men in higher education enrollment.
And what happens when you have an entire generation of highly educated women? They enter the workforce. The labor market data reflects this massive social transformation. The ratio of female to male labor force participation surged from historically about 46% up to over 67%.
That jump represents millions of women moving from the unpaid domestic sphere into the active economic sphere. But the most vital piece of data here is the nature of their employment. Up to 94% of employed women are categorized as wage or salaried workers.
I really want to highlight why that matters. In a lot of developing economies, women work, but they're in the informal sector.
Right. Selling goods on the street, unpaid agricultural labor.
Exactly. But here, 94% are firmly employed, receiving official wages.
Mass access to higher education formalized the female workforce. When 94% of your working women are in the formal wage sector, you fundamentally altered the social fabric toward institutional participation. This human capital reserve is the ultimate bright spot in the entire 60-year data set.
It is the Formula One engine. You have a population mathematically primed for a high-tech knowledge economy. If you drop this workforce into a Silicon Valley regulatory environment, the output would be staggering.
Without a doubt.
Which makes the broken transmission of their macroeconomy all the more tragic. But before we diagnose exactly why it's broken, I want to explore one more curious statistical reality: the accidental green economy.
This environmental sustainability metric is a fascinating puzzle.
The numbers show a surprisingly light environmental footprint. Total CO2 emissions excluding land use are consistently kept really low, between 21 and 41 megatons.
And there's a World Bank metric called adjusted savings minus energy depletion, and it sits at a minuscule 0.1% to 0.7%.
Basically, they're barely making a dent in their natural resources. Now, objectively, this is a highly positive metric. Developed nations spend billions trying to force their emissions down to these levels.
They do.
But ask yourself, is this low-carbon reality a product of advanced green policy? Are they building huge solar grids and enforcing strict ecotech regulations?
The data strongly suggests it's something else entirely. While they do have environmental regulations, this extreme low-carbon reality is largely a byproduct of macroeconomic necessity.
Right. Remember the deindustrialization data? Manufacturing dropping to 10%.
That is the key. Heavy industry steel mills, concrete, coal plants, these drive high carbon emissions. Because their heavy industry withered away, they simply lack the machinery that produces heavy emissions.
You can't have industrial pollution if you don't have industry.
Precisely. And look at transportation. Because of extreme import restrictions, motor vehicle ownership is severely limited. A population relying on state transit or bicycles naturally generates a fraction of the emissions of a car-centric society.
So it's an accidental sustainability. The environment is preserved, but the mechanism preserving it is economic stagnation.
A fascinating, if unintended, consequence.
All right, we've mapped the whole asymmetrical matrix. We have the demographic time bomb, the macroeconomic roller coaster, the accidental green economy, and the sheer triumph of world-class human capital.
Which brings us to the final and most critical analytical layer.
The million-dollar question. If you have this incredibly educated, exceptionally healthy, highly formalized workforce, why hasn't it translated into a booming economy?
To answer that, we look at the institutional ecosystem. Human capital doesn't exist in a vacuum. It needs a regulatory framework to thrive. And for this, we turn to the World Bank's global governance indicators.
And the data here is just as extreme as the medical data, but in the exact opposite direction. They rank incredibly low globally. Let's look at voice and accountability.
Which measures freedom of expression, media, and selecting the government.
Right. The data places them in the bottom 2nd to 14th percentile globally.
Meaning 86% to 98% of countries on Earth rank higher in that specific metric.
Then there's regulatory quality, which is critical for economic growth. It measures the government's ability to promote private sector development. They sit at a dismal 3rd to 13th percentile.
And rule of law fluctuates between the 11th and 42nd percentiles.
So what does this all mean?
This raises an important question. When you cross this governance data with the human capital data, the conclusion is profound. You can have brilliant doctors and engineers. But if regulatory quality is rigidly restrictive,
if it takes months to get a business permit, or private enterprise is heavily penalized.
Exactly. If property rights are insecure, that human capital is trapped. It cannot easily translate into private sector innovation or economic growth.
This is the shattered transmission. The F1 engine is revving, the people are smart and healthy, but the gears of the economy are jammed by a regulatory system in the third percentile. The governance metrics are the definitive structural bottleneck choking the engine.
And when regulatory quality limits private sector agility, the state usually tries to direct all economic activity centrally. But as the 20% agricultural collapses show, centralized direction without private sector dynamism fails to generate the productivity needed to offset that demographic time bomb.
Let's pull this together. Based on 6 decades of data, Cuba presents a radically asymmetrical development matrix. First world health and education strapped to third world macroeconomic structures and highly restrictive governance.
And the inescapable takeaway is that this matrix is rapidly running out of time. The demographic alarm is ringing right now.
Yes, shrinking, aging population.
The social support structure will radically shift in the next 10 years. The worker-to-retiree ratio will become economically unsustainable without massive new wealth.
Because you can't pay for a first world healthcare system for the elderly using a collapsed industrial base. Increasing productivity is an existential requirement now.
The data strongly suggests the status quo is statistically untenable. Reforming the regulatory environment to release private sector vitality is the crucial step. They have to let the human capital engine drive the economy or the whole machine stalls out. Human capital is just potential energy. Institutional flexibility is the spark to turn it into kinetic growth.
It's a profound paradox. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. If a nation can build an incredibly healthy, highly educated society without vast wealth, but ultimately cannot sustain its economy without institutional and regulatory flexibility, what does that tell us about the blueprint for human prosperity?
It's a fascinating diagnostic challenge.
Is human capital ever truly enough if the machinery of society won't let it run? Think about how that applies globally. Because sometimes a nation's greatest vulnerabilities aren't in the health of its people, but in the connective tissue of the rules that bind them.
Very well said.
Until next time, keep diving deep.